That's awesome. Thanks. Yeah. So, hey, thank you so much. Welcome, everybody, and really appreciate you carving out a little bit of time to learn more about how AWS Managed Services can help you de-risk your migration. So, AWS Managed Services, if you're not familiar with it, and you're going to hear Mike and I refer to it a lot today as AMS, we basically operate AWS infrastructure on behalf of AWS customers. So we're going to talk a lot about some of the reasons why that may be a good fit for your organization. What we're going to cover today in the webinar is first talk about some of these risks that we see. One of the things that we're privileged in AMS to operate large IT estates in AWS for some very, very large customers. And so we've learned a lot from doing that over the last couple of years. And so we're going to share a lot of those learnings with you. We're going to specifically tell you about AMS and the service and what we do and how it might fit into your business. We have a really cool case study to share with you as well. And then we'll definitely take some Q&A. So, and we have the ability to answer some of your questions as we go as well. So feel free to type those into the chat. And with that, let's jump in. So as you heard, I'm joined by Mike Eshu.
Hey, Rocco. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Eshu, and I'm a technical program manager with AWS Managed Services, and I focus on helping customers onboard to the AWS Managed Services offering.
Yeah. So in other words, Mike's a smart guy that I brought with me for the webinar today. So cool. So let's jump in, and let's start by talking about some of those risks that were alluded to in the webinar title. In a lot of ways, the AWS platform itself and all the functionality and services that we wrap into it are designed to remove a lot of the risk from your migration to the cloud. But there are still some areas when it comes to planning your migration and kind of thinking about the steps you need to take to get from point A to point B, where some risk can get introduced. And again, we've learned a lot from some of the large customers that we're working with. And so wanted to share some of those learnings with you. To do that, let's kind of start by looking at some of the most common drivers for migrating to the cloud that we see. A lot of organizations are really interested in running DevOps at scale, and AWS as a platform is a really great platform for doing that. So that's one of the top drivers we see. Certainly, data center consolidation is another top driver. For large enterprises, divestitures and mergers and acquisitions is another big one that we see where cloud is a great opportunity to solve problems there. And then just general digital transformation is another top driver that we see from customers. One of the first things that we learned, though, is that while these drivers sometimes can kind of dictate the timing and urgency around the move to the cloud, it's really important to remember that themselves, they are not inherently a reason to move to the cloud. In other words, implementing DevOps itself is amazing, but it's not the outcome, right? Digital transformation or data center consolidation, they're not the outcome, right? The outcome is we have to go kind of up a level in order to think about the outcome and what we actually hope to achieve through DevOps or digital transformation or data center consolidation. There's a great survey from IT leaders from 451 Research. They were asked, what are the key reasons that you're looking to move to the cloud? And they probably had a lot of those drivers from the previous slide, but you can see here that these were some of the actual outcomes they were hoping to achieve. Certainly, saving money seems to be number one in a lot of these surveys. Getting additional scalability was a really popular outcome here. Time to market and agility, which we talk a lot about innovation in AWS. That was a top driver outcome. Improved availability and uptime, resiliency was one, and then less to manage internally. So these are 5 top outcomes that customers were looking to achieve. I actually think you can lump these basically into 3 buckets, right? There really are 3 big reasons to move to the cloud. across all those drivers. And the first one is greater, faster, improved innovation so that you can provide better service to your customers, right? And so we can get that through DevOps implementations and digital transformation, but ultimately what we're trying to get there is faster innovation so we can serve our customers better. Obviously, the second reason is saving money, and that's an important one. And then the third reason, which kind of ties back to some of those outcomes on the previous slide around scalability and resiliency, is reduced risk. Ultimately, we're trying to have lower the risk profile in our enterprise. And so that really leads to kind of the first big risk, or you could call it a learning from the large organizations that we've worked with, is in some cases we've seen customers get really excited about migrating to AWS, and they have one of those drivers present that's triggering them to look at a migration right now. And in some cases, they didn't map it all the way back to the outcome they were looking to achieve. We like to call this working backwards, thinking about as an IT organization who your customer is and the end goal that they're looking to achieve. Is it reducing costs? Is it reducing risk? Is it improving innovation? And that's kind of probably the first big lesson that we've learned. And then let's take a look at another set of learnings that we've seen from our customers. Some of you may be familiar with the work AWS has done on the cloud adoption framework. These three circles you see represent the really high level stages for a large organization to adopt the cloud. Foundation is all about building your account and putting the pieces in place that you need before you start building new apps or migrating. Migration is obviously getting workloads from on-prem or wherever they exist today into AWS. And then operation is obviously the active, kind of the ongoing upkeep and management of those workloads. If you do those three stages right, this is really what your cloud journey should look like. Often, even before we start building out our foundation, we start with a project or a series of small projects. And then when we're ready to build out AWS at scale, it's time to build our foundations. And the further along in this journey we get from foundation building to workload migration into ongoing operation, the more value we get. And it's not just for any net new or sometimes what we call cloud native workloads. It's for our legacy workloads that we're migrating as well. So this is what your journey should look like. And if we do this correctly, there are a lot of great success stories in AWS that we can point to. These are just a few that you may have seen. And again, if you look at the kind of notes about what News Corp or GE or Hess or what these guys were able to accomplish, you can tie these back to one of those three core outcomes, right? Cost savings was certainly a big one in a couple of these cases. Reduced provisioning time equals greater innovation, and so that was really important. And then in the case of Hess, being able to divest some business units really quickly, that allowed them to de-risk their M&A activity, which was a critical driver for them. So if you build out your foundation and do your migration and get your operation right, this is what cloud migration can look like. Unfortunately, though, one of the things that we see a lot when working with customers is that of the three phases of adoption, foundation, migration, and operation, we see that customers often over-index on migration, right? In some cases, cloud adoption equals migration. And migration is obviously critically important, and we want to get it right. But by over-indexing on migration, sometimes we forget to put the amount of work and planning and thought into foundation and operation. And if we do that, we've observed that creates some challenges for customers. Mike, I know you work really closely with some customers and you've seen this. So, jump in and kind of share what you've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, it's so much about getting to production ready, right? So, certainly a huge aspect of adopting cloud is experimentation. Though, as you start thinking about the migration problem to really gain confidence in the business, you need to get to production ready quickly. So you don't want to get stuck in analysis paralysis, and you want to understand that your cloud operating model, cloud environment can evolve over time. there isn't one-way doors here. You're able to actually start getting an environment that's production ready, selecting the right types of applications that meet the risk posture that's appropriate for your earliest tranches of migration. And once you get those applications to production ready, and once you've gone through an incident that will inevitably occur once you're in production operations, you're going to gain confidence, and that's going to actually let you increase your velocity. So the key is give some thought to foundations, but then move forward and get applications to production. Exit from the experimentation phase and into the production ready phase. And then that becomes a circle. You're going to continue to experiment and improve while at the same time continuing to operate production workloads.
Okay, so, and then I hear you talk about it all the time, right? So when customers are building their foundation and they're getting ready to go to try to do migration at scale, they don't think about operation early enough, right? So, like, what does that actually mean?
Absolutely, and frankly, as we work with customers that are interested in adopting AWS Managed Services (AMS), we always say, let's right away, let's go ahead and start engaging the customer operations team. Let's start talking through our operational use cases. And let's treat this like classic IT process development, where we're sitting over the tabletop, exercising our processes, talking them through with one another, and then moving forward into game day simulation type activities, so that we're building our confidence with the tools, building our confidence with the people who are going to be taking on these responsibilities, proving to ourselves that we're comfortable operating in the cloud, that we understand how to leverage cloud capabilities for the availability requirements the applications might have.
I think you shared an anecdote with me the other day that ties to the security incident bullet that's there, where you described that the migration team ultimately got blocked by migration because they were being asked to operate the environment at the same time they were migrating. And when incidents came up, they would have to address those and it would derail them. Like, can you give us a little more color on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a common stall, right? Is if you follow a lot of the AWS methodology, which is holistic, but if you're not expanding as you're migrating those workloads, your migration team is actually also your operations team. And I think when you think about operating model and who does what, that's probably an incorrect allocation of resources as you move to production ready. Right? If you've got folks that are focused on cloud architecture and data migration, also tap to be the incident managers and resolvers, you're not building a sustaining operating model that's going to allow for continued cloud migrations to get to those 500, 1,000, for particularly large customers, maybe 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 workloads or applications. So you've got to be thinking about your holistic operating model and who's going to do what, not only in the inception, but as you scale past those milestones of, hey, we've got 5 applications into production, we've got 50 applications into production. You really need to be thinking about what that full estate in production is going to look like, and how the staffing plan, the process planning, and the people plan, and the tooling plans are going to evolve along with the adoption and migration strategy.
Yeah, that's great. It's not just some anecdotal situations that we've been involved with. Again, that 451 research study that I referred to earlier, they actually asked these IT leaders what were some of the top post-migration pain points that they were experiencing, and you'll see that a lot of them correlate directly back to some of those issues on the past 2 slides. The top pain point for the IT leaders was that cost and budget, and let me explain what I think that is happening there. Right, so in your existing data centers, you have a lot of governance and process in place to manage and control costs and make sure they tie back to the way you had intended to use certain infrastructure or run certain workloads. And there's a lot of great capabilities for managing costs and governing usage in the cloud. And yet, if you don't consider those operators in your operations team and the tools that they need to do that, and if they need new tools to give them time to figure those out and train on them, then what can happen right away, especially if you're running DevOps, is developers are experimenting and they're building and they're innovating, and then sometimes there can be cost overruns because they're not accustomed to managing the governance of that as well. And the operations team wasn't consulted early enough. So for IT leaders, that was the top post-migration pain. But you see there's quite a few others, and they all basically relate back to operations, right? So unfortunately, security and compliance is often not considered early enough when we're building foundations and doing migrations. And the moment you have a production workload migrated over, there can be issues, and that was a top post-migration pain point. Not considering, again, this is kind of the working backwards point we made earlier, not considering the end customer, whether it's an internal business unit or the customers themselves. Having to manage in a hybrid environment can be difficult. Insufficient staff. Ultimately, a lot of these relate back to operations pain. And our belief is that these come up because operations were not considered early enough in the planning process. And that really is, that manifests itself in a slightly different version of that picture that I showed you earlier. If we try to apply our existing operational model as is, right? Same processes, same tools, same people with their same skills, and we try to apply that to the cloud. In some cases, we've seen this phenomenon that we call the great stall, which is you start getting some value as you start migrating, but ultimately those paper cuts from the previous slides start adding up, and we're not able to get the maximum amount of value because our migration slows down, because those folks are getting bogged down by operational issues. And the operations team who's trying to get involved and really solve all those problems is not enabled and trained, and they don't have the right tools. And so if we don't consider operations early enough, we often see that smooth cycle to getting value out of the cloud is disrupted. And that's, if it's not obvious, that is the second big thing that we've learned in the last 18 months operating AWS infrastructure for big customers is if we don't consider operations at the very beginning of the process, we sometimes can have these hiccups. And when we do, our migrations go a lot more smoothly. And I want to go back to this slide one more time because I think there's something worth calling out on this slide that is not being talked about enough, and that is somewhere down. So there are 8 or 9 post-migration pain points represented here on this 451 survey, and somewhere down towards the bottom of the list is skill shortage, and right above that is insufficient staff. And so while these are being called out as pain points, they're not being called out as the top pain points by the IT leaders that filled out the survey. And frankly, from our experience, not having enough people in your organization that are experts in operating large IT estates in the cloud and not arming your existing people with enough training and skills, we're seeing that emerge as a top barrier to large organizations being able to adopt the cloud. So frankly, I actually think I'm surprised that those are so low on this list. And I think they're going to start becoming even more top of mind for CIOs and other leaders in the IT organization as we go forward.
Well, of course you could. I mean, if you go back to it for a second, you could sum, if you sum insufficient skills with skills shortage, right? Those could be, maybe I don't have the headcount I need to operate at the scale I need. So you really need to be investing in automation, which means hiring more senior staff with additional skills to sort of operate away or automate away some of that, human challenge, right? But yeah, I think these are all really interrelated, right? I mean, cost and budget, project timelines extending out, therefore costs going up, because we're spending additional time resolving concerns from the security team who maybe haven't been trained up on modern cloud security skills, right? So they're all very much interrelated. Yeah. And I think, as you think about your strategy to address these, it needs to be holistic versus more of a Pareto-driven analysis. Oh, I'm just going to go focus on cost budget. Well, you're actually not going to get to the root of it, which is probably being evidenced by some of the items below.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the lack of skills is leading to a lot of those other issues that those IT leaders are calling out. And so another industry analyst that tends to have a lot of smart things to say about what's happening with the changes in IT and cloud. They're predicting here that it is going to become a top issue, and that it's not only going to start to have issues within IT, this lack of skills, but it's going to start having visible consequences for the greater business. So, and again, that's one of the reasons why AMS was launched, was sort of to help address that. And so obviously that kind of ties into the third big mistake or risk that we've observed, which is underestimating and underinvesting in people, right? So there's a saying that we use a lot: people, process, technology. Unfortunately, sometimes we see people invest in the opposite order. We invest heavily in automation and technology. We're smart enough to know that we need a good process, and so we invest in that. And yet we invest in people last, or we don't invest in people enough. And that underinvestment in our people and the impact that moving to the cloud will have on the culture of our IT organization, in the hiring that we may need to do, and in the skill training, and underestimating the value of experience. That's kind of the last big mistake or risk that we're gonna talk about here, and arguably probably the biggest mistake that we see organizations make as they're getting ready to move to the cloud. And so that's a lot of what we've learned in the AMS business, operating large scale IT in AWS for big AWS customers in the last couple of years. And so now that we've given you kind of some of that context, hopefully not only can you kind of factor that in if you're thinking about an at scale migration to the cloud, but now we also want to give you a little bit more about information about AMS and specifically how we address some of these problems. So Mike, why don't you kind of give us a run through of AMS?
Sure, thanks, Rocco. So AMS launched in December of 2016, very much in response to customers asking us to help them with their AWS operational activities. I think we heard from some of our largest customers, some of the largest companies on the planet, time and again. We'd like prescriptive guidance on how to build our landing zone, or that is that foundation operating environment, so I can start migrating workloads into production, not for dev test, and feel really great that if we do have those downtime incidents and we do encounter, work as we learn to work with these cloud technologies, we know we can get our businesses up and running, while at the same time our staff are learning along with the team as we go through this migration journey. And so, I'd argue AMS, and we can certainly instantiate it in a way that's optimized for the migration use case, right? To really focus on that lift and shift migration, where we can get workloads running in production on AWS and start collecting the tremendous amount of data that AWS gives you when you're running workloads within AWS. So that's operational metrics from your instances, cost information, security recommendations, and then tuning and continuously improving the environment to take care of those cloud opportunities, and in terms of cost down, security insights based on a lot of the tooling that's running in AWS. Think about Macy, Guard Duty, AWS Inspector, AWS Trusted Advisor. There's all these streams of information and insight, and then actually help and work with customers to take action against those opportunities. And so, as Rocco was alluding to, people, process, technology, I spend a lot of time thinking about that, and the diagram on the slide today helps you think about who's going to do what, right? So at the foundation, we have the AWS services that you can consume, today from the AWS console. And on top of that, we've built a layer of interfaces to allow for automated integration and interaction with your AWS services backed by an operations team. And then on top of that, you're going to have your operations personnel that are looking after application operations, application upgrades, application enhancements. But really, in a lift and shift type scenario, we want to build that foundation of AWS services, make for systematic calling for those services via migration tooling, and then get those applications up and running, tested, validated in your cloud operating environment, and a very easy, sort of uneventful cutover process. And now your applications are operating in the cloud. Thoughtfully thought through in a tranche-based migration perspective, but once those applications are over, you can rest assured that the infrastructure is being operated, according to AWS best practice, taking advantage of cloud capabilities and cost down.
Mike, why does AMS only operate infrastructure for customers as opposed to end to end through the application?
Yeah, sure. I think we really focus on when we stop at the patched operating system, we kind of believe those lower level infrastructure management tasks are really undifferentiated heavy lifting. And we think there's a tremendous opportunity to automate a lot of those tasks away. And we're doing that very actively today, right? So our hope over time is that the operating of traditional compute-based, VM-based infrastructure, supported by our relational database service and other data storage technologies that are offered from AWS, starts to become, an uneventful. Right, and all the business value is up at that application level layer, and we're able to get the infrastructure off the critical path as a part of a migration, or of course follow on innovation opportunities.
Okay, great. And I notice it says the word partner on the slide as well. So if AMS is operating the infrastructure, it could be the customer or their AO partner that's running.
Sure, absolutely. We see all different sorts of operating models. We have situations where customers have retained application operations staff, quite usually not changing when they go through the migration, right? So my partner who's operating my SAP applications today are going to continue to be the very same partner, and we're just going to route tickets to the AWS infrastructure operator. And I think we also see, partners continuing to provide that tier one help desk, taking that first call from an end customer that's saying, hey, the application performance is degraded. What do I do? Right. And they're going through their preset runbooks to hopefully determine if it's an infrastructure or application issue, and then bringing the team together to resolve the customer issue that's been reported.
Cool. Okay. So once we built that out for the customer and we migrated over there, talk about what we do to operate on an ongoing basis.
Sure, absolutely. So the slide here has some different feature areas carved out, right? But essentially what we've done is started with an automation platform. So we front a set of APIs that are meant to be integrated with a customer's service management suite. And they're able to call for systematic fulfillment of demand. So I think sometimes when people think of automation, they imagine a human operator sitting at a console with a bunch of buttons that they can push in response to demand from end customers. I think the world is going to quickly change to realize that the automation ought to be out in front, and really the humans are sitting behind that operations or that automation, dealing with any defects that occur during the automation, or of course enhancing that library of content that is the automation itself. So we do that with a provisioning system. We have a set of best practice patterns, common, just EC2 compute instances, or a single EC2 instance in an auto scaling group that provides auto healing. These are really common migration patterns. You'll also see 2- and 3-tier web stacks in our catalog, in other networking, DNS type catalog items, the ability to request access. That's all built into our change management system that we'll talk through in a minute. From a security and compliance standpoint, AMS looks after the whole estate, the foundation setup. So that's establishing networking within AWS to be integrated with the customer's corporate networking environment. That's going to include route propagation. It'll include DNS integration. And certainly access management integration. The foundation of our access management system is a managed Active Directory controller, trusted back to the customer's corporate systems. And then we also work with the customer to manage their IAM policies, roles that can then be integrated from their federation technology system, sort of extending that corporate environment into the cloud. So we're not reinventing our security controls. Rather, we're simply integrating existing security controls into the managed cloud environment.
Hey, Mike, Chris from the webinar sent in a great question about compliance. He asked about some specific ones like HIPAA and PCI. Can you talk about how we handle that?
Sure, yeah. So today, the foundation, the AWS foundation is, we have PCI attestation, we are HIPAA compliant, we have ISO 9001, 27001 families of standards on into SOC 1, 2, and 3 compliance, where we're able to, out of the box, get up and running with support for those different compliance requirements. So you're not delayed auditing your infrastructure operations or your infrastructure technology provider. So you've got AWS at the base, AMS on top of that, providing the infrastructure operations, and then the only area we need to, the customer would then have responsibility for ensuring compliance of would be at that application operating layer. And in the migration use case, that's often already done. So it's just a very quick update audit or a pretty limited scope audit because so much is already attestated or conformant with those different standards.
Great.
And then we go into monitoring and alerting. When we migrate these workloads over, we're systematically introducing AWS services that are optimized for cloud compute operations. So that's AWS CloudWatch for metric level data coming off of instances. We're enabling CloudTrail, which is an AWS service that allows for really monitoring of that cloud environment. So we're not just purely lifting and shifting and not changing a thing. We're integrating to these cloud-enabled operational tools and systems that's going to allow for enhanced data collection that's going to help us as we get into the service continuum improvement processes. We're always helping our customers with cost optimization, so leveraging AWS Trusted Advisor. We're not just looking at those recommendations, but we're actually going to work with the customer to improve instance sizing is so often the huge cost opportunity coming out of migration. Hey, look, we've over-provisioned the instances. We wanted to ensure the services came up, were production ready. The business had confidence in our cloud program. But hey, look, here's an opportunity for optimization. Let's take it. And working with the business, we can oftentimes very quickly find money-saving opportunities quickly after workloads have been migrated. And that's got to happen every month.
Yeah, we had a customer come back to us somewhat in shock a couple months ago when they saw a report that we had saved them 35% on their AWS bill that month. And they knew we were trying to optimize their spend on AWS, but they couldn't believe that we had proactively saved them so much money. And in some ways, it's counterintuitive, right? Because we're AWS, but we also know, thinking back to that slide before about some of the post-migration pain, that if your expectation is that you're going to be able to save money on your IT estate when you go to the cloud and that isn't realized, that's not a good customer experience. So that's definitely one of the key parts of our service.
Well, and I think, in order to ensure that a migration to the cloud is successful, cost has always got to be in mind, right? I mean, I think very few folks move to the cloud without hoping they're going to get some cost advantage in doing so, right? And I think that's something the cloud has proven to be very capable of, but it won't happen without effort, right? If you just sort of ignore your cost spend and don't think about the utilization of your resources and you don't take the time to invest in attaining that cost savings, you're not going to get it, which is one of the reasons we put that front and center in the AMS offer, right? We want to help customers through that journey. So on into patch management, we're supporting both traditional inline patching, a high degree of patch conformance. We believe that's critical to the security of your workloads in the cloud. And then we're also doing monthly Amazon machine image production that's loaded with our tool chain that allows us to operate at scale, right? So we're helping with the Omni management scenario. I mentioned change management. That's our collection of change types that you can deploy for systematic outcomes. And then, of course, we can also help with manual changes if the change type that you require isn't in our catalog. But our goal will, of course, be to immediately instantiate those change types for future automated execution. This also allows for us to broker approval cycles. Does AMS need to approve a given, potentially we might view an IAM policy request as high risk, and we'd want to manually talk through that with our security stakeholders, with the customer. Hey, is this really something you want to do, or is there a better way of achieving the same security outcome in a least privileged or perhaps on-demand fashion? Incident management, we own the infrastructure operations incident management processes. Oftentimes we're able to remediate, let's call it low severity incidents with automation. So think, we're seeing disk space volume full. We can systematically expand the size of that volume. But of course, in more serious incidents, that involves spinning up a conference bridge, working with application operations teams, business stakeholders, maybe a higher order incident escalations to folks that can help remediate the issue and restore service. And then last on the slide is availability management, always working with you through regular rehearsals to facilitate DR activities. Via our change management catalog, we're vending multi-availability zone infrastructure patterns. So as availability becomes more of a concern for specific applications, you've purchased the right infrastructure and architectures to give you the availability your business requires.
Great. Okay, so that's what we do. Let's talk a little bit about how we do it, Mike.
Sure. Yeah, I think, I mentioned automation, right? The key is leading with those automated interfaces and connecting your automation routines from one to the other. So your monitoring system needs to be systematically wired into your change management system. And, with a business rules engine to say, again, using that example, hey, the disk space volume is filling up. Let's go ahead and fire off a systematic change to expand that volume, while also alerting the application team that they're consuming more storage than they expected. And that's probably a problem record that needs to go be investigated. We're open source. All these different artifacts and content I've been discussing is deployed into the AMS account. We're not trying to develop a set of secret sauce here. We want customers to see how we're leveraging the different AWS services to provide these operational and cost outcomes.
And that's really important because of that third point there about being month to month. So when we started AMS a couple of years ago, there was one foundational element that was really important to us, and that was that it would be easy on and easy off. Because our goal is to enable customers to get on the cloud quickly and start realizing value. Our goal is not necessarily to be your long-term infrastructure outsourcer. And in fact, a lot of the customers that are running on AMS today are using us as a bridge to get into AWS more quickly. And then the goal is for them to resume operations with their own team. And that's our goal as well. So we not only make it really easy for you to get off, but a lot of the run books, a lot of the automation scripts, a lot of the best practices that we use in well operated, which Mike will talk about in a second, we make those available to customers so they can easily transition back to running AWS infrastructure themselves if they want to. France sent a great question through about training. Does AWS offer training so that my operations team can get more up to speed on what it's like to run a large IT estate in the cloud? The answer is absolutely. We have world-class training, both on-demand and classroom-based. But we find that that's kind of a mid to long-term solution to the issue of the skills shortage. When we talk to a lot of CIOs who are trying to looking to adopt AWS to get the value, we found that if they felt like their organization didn't have enough of those skills in-house right now, they were faced with two choices. They either waited months or years while they hired new people and gave their existing people the opportunity to up-level their skills, or they went to an outsourcer and signed a 5 or 10 year outsourcing contract. And we just felt like both options could be great options depending on your organization, but there needed to be a middle ground. And in some ways, that's what AMS is, right? We can operate your environment for you while, during the migration or during the transition for 6, 12 months, 24 months, and then empower your people to take back control of it later. And that was an important, use case that we built the service with.
Sure, absolutely. And so we kind of have these well-operated tenets that we think through and sort of lead us and guide us as we build our service and offer our service to our customers. First, work backwards, right? Treat your cloud operating model as a product. Listen to your users. Make sure they have the capabilities they need to make the business successful. Following the spirit of the law, right? We see a lot of sort of IT policy that was written long ago, right? And And you're trying to follow that spirit, but at the same time, we encourage you to challenge your teams to think about how these policies need to be evolved for modern cloud operations. A quick example being you can only run an an Active Directory rolled Windows server on bare metal hardware. I think the cloud starts to evolve the way we might think about that. Apply guardrails, not barriers, right? Help your teams innovate, work with your teams to get the outcomes they need from the technology demands that the cloud can fulfill. Run lean teams, smaller is faster, two pizza team concept you hear a lot about at Amazon. Operate like code, which means codify everything, which then means automate everything, right? If you have to do something more than once or twice, try not to do it manually again. I often say, hire some engineers that get a little bit of cranky when they have to do something twice.
Yeah, that's great. Mike, I know you wanted an opportunity to kind of challenge the audience a little bit as they think about how everything we've shared applies to their organization.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, really, what I would encourage you to ensure that you have let's call it a minimum viable strategy to operate your cloud migrated workload so you don't hit that stall, right? I don't want you not to start migrating, but I do want to make sure you've thought through who's going to architect and operate that cloud environment, who is going to do what. Really challenge yourself to populate a good old-fashioned, perhaps rather boring, racy chart. What processes are going to have to evolve to achieve true value, right? The way you think about IT operations is evolving and changing. That's okay. Let's get those people who have been appointed to think through the processes that need to evolve versus just accepting them for what they were to be when they were invented perhaps 10, 15, 20 years ago. And then lastly, what's going to be your path and road to operate new operations tools? I wouldn't encourage you to retool your whole environment during a migration, right? I would try to keep the change to a minimum so that you can get productive to the business and leverage that cloud data that you're acquiring, right? So just some things to think about as you go through your journey.
That's awesome. All right, so we're gonna take some questions here in a moment, but before we do that, I just was really excited to share one case study for you of a customer who successfully adopted AWS, both in terms of being able to build some really cool, innovative new apps in AWS, as well as do some lift and shift migration. It's a company in the UK called SGN that operates gas pipelines throughout the country. And specifically, I think of this case study as a story about the CIO there. His name is Andrew Quayle. He was brave enough to look at some of these tough questions in advance, and when he got back some tough answers, to really dig into them and figure them out. So before we get to Q&A, I thought I'd tell you the story about Andrew and SGN. This camper is the way that Andrew thought of his IT estate before he started moving to the cloud. This actually comes from a slide he himself presented multiple times. Just the notion that their legacy systems were kind of holding them back from what they really wanted to achieve, and that led to a cloud migration project. Andrew did work backwards by considering who his customers were. And first and foremost, he thought of his customers as being the organization and the board. And so when he created his IT strategy and cloud migration strategy, he intentionally didn't call it a cloud migration strategy because it was really just a strategy for the business. And it aligned back to not only the board priorities, but also all of those other customers internally, like his boss, the CEO, like the CFO, and like the line of business stakeholders. And he really looked at what they cared about, what outcomes they wanted to get out of it, and really worked hard to align his cloud migration strategy to those outcomes. He also definitely didn't make the mistake of thinking about his people too late. He considered his people early, and he did some pretty interesting tactical things to help his team adjust to this all-in cloud approach. One thing he did early was create a CCOE, which is a Cloud Center of Excellence, and actually enabled, in order to make sure that they could operate with a different culture and a different operating model while the rest of the organization was still operating their existing estate, he moved them into a different physical location, which he credits with them being able to move fast and kind of create a little bit of a new culture. And he started early. giving his team time to think about a lot of the changes that would be represented. He also invested heavily in training, and he was prepared for the fact that not everyone in his team was going to be interested in making the journey to the cloud. The migration project itself is pretty interesting. Mike, I don't know if you want to just call out a few observations about the SGN migration.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that they kind of imbibed some of the advice we've given in this presentation and really looked to mitigate those risks, right? They have a lot of vendors involved in executing the migration, and really went through a pretty holistic planning regime, but that it also didn't hold them back from experimenting and beginning execution, right? So I think they've sort of, frankly, they frame our thoughts as we put this presentation together, right? And I think working with them helps.
Yeah, one other really interesting observation about their migration is eventually there's going to be a lot of legacy apps that when we move them to the cloud that we want to refactor to get a lot of value out of them and cost savings and resiliency. But they did something that we think is really smart, which is they migrated those workloads to AWS first, and now they're working on refactoring them. And what we really like about that is there's a bias to action there that allows you to kind of get your project going. You also get some cost savings out of moving them to the cloud and some other benefits. And they modeled it around moving the workloads to the cloud first and using those cost savings to in part fund the refactoring work that has to happen, which is another smart decision that they made. And they got some great outcomes out of it, not the least of which were directly their customers. This is you see a screenshot of an article on the screen about how they were actually able to refund their customers some money based on a lot of the cost savings that they got in part through moving to the cloud, which was an important opportunity for them. And so to kind of summarize what AMS is all about, one of the questions we got from Rizwan was like, okay, so net it out for me. How do I think about AMS? I'll tell you how Andrew, the CIO of SGN, thought about AMS. To him, he was thinking about that skill shortage top of mind, and this helped mitigate that. It allowed him to get onto AWS a lot faster than he thought. He knew that you can actually be more secure and more compliant in the cloud as long as you set things up correctly, and so AMS helped him do that. He's excited that by AMS handling the undifferentiated infrastructure, it'll enable his team to move more quickly and focus more on innovation. And certainly they saved a lot of money, not just in the infrastructure savings with AWS, but in operational savings that AMS is able to operate more efficiently for them. And so that's a story of SGN. So there's a bunch of great questions. We're getting near the end of the webinar, so I want to jump in and take some of these questions. And so why don't we jump in? I think I saw one question here that I thought was great from Joss. So I think this is for you, Mike.
Yep.
Which ITSM tools and automation are compatible with AMS?
That's right. I answered in chat.
Oh, great.
So hopefully folks can see we're really compatible with any ITSM system that can be integrated with AWS APIs, which should just be about anything you're using. Then also mentioned we've kind of taken care of that technical integration specifically for ServiceNow. You can find that app in the ServiceNow App Store.
Okay. That's great.
And I think also somebody, George had asked us if we could pop back those questions to consider.
Yeah.
Slide.
That's a good idea. One other question I saw is we talked about the curated AWS services and management tools that we provide in the AMS account. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the key AWS services that we deploy?
Sure, yeah. I mean, from an operations standpoint, we're using Support Center for all of our ticket and incident exchange. And then we're using CloudWatch, CloudTrail, the sort of very common operational services to monitor and evaluate the infrastructure. We're using CloudWatch logs for log aggregation. Obviously, S3 supports a lot of where this content exists. Then into some of the systems manager suite. So EC2 systems manager for on-command execution. We're in the process of adopting SSM automation for AWS API routines and scripts. We've been using a proprietary system until now. And then a suite of patching tools are also integrated within SSM. So really check out the Simple Systems Manager suite that's integrated into AWS. we're really building what we believe is kind of best-in-class content that will operate on top of that suite for the operational outcomes such as confidentiality and availability.
That's awesome, Mike. Okay, so we're out of time. There was a bunch of additional great questions that we didn't get to, so we'll follow up with all of you offline to make sure that we've gotten your questions. And if you want to proactively reach out to us to get more information, this is Rocco speaking. Feel free to send me an email. My email's there on the slide. And thanks for joining us on a Monday, and thanks for your time, and have a great week.